Hi everyone, welcome to Mobile DevOps is a Thing, a podcast by Bitrise showcasing developers from all around the world. Today, we'll be talking to John Sundell about how mobile teams can benefit from consultancy, how they can level up their skills, and the role of test automation and continuous delivery in productive collaboration. My name is Nora Bezi, and I'm here today with two of my colleagues, Anna Batki from Product Marketing.
Hi all.
Hi Anna. And Shams Ahmed, iOS developer.
Hey all, nice to meet you.
And our special guest today is John Sundell.
Hi, it's really great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. So I guess you don't need much of an introduction, but for the listeners who might not be familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you've been up to, and just anything you'd like people to know about you?
Sure. I am primarily a Swift developer. I love to work in many different programming languages, but these last couple of years, I've been mainly focused on Swift. And about 3 years ago now, I started writing weekly articles about Swift, and I started later a website called Swift by Sundell, which also later turned into a podcast, now a YouTube channel, and many other things as well. So these days, my main focus is, besides still being a programmer and writing a lot of code, is to write weekly articles about Swift, a podcast about Swift, and try to contribute as much as I can to the overall iOS developer and Apple developer community.
Sounds like you've been doing so many things simultaneously, like all this freelancing, open source development, blogging, podcasting, and so on. What's your main motivation to do all of these things?
So my motivation has kind of changed a little bit over time, and it continues to change. Like, I get motivated by different things during different, phases and different parts of my life and my career. So when I initially started this whole initiative, it was when I started writing weekly articles. And this was before I had a website. This was before I had any plans really to do this, not only do it full time, but to do this on a regular basis. So I just created a Medium account and I just started writing weekly articles there on Medium because I had been working for about 3.5 years at Spotify, where I was an iOS developer. And I left to become a freelancer. And when I became a freelancer, I kind of decided that I wanted to reserve some time to contribute back to the community at large. I wanted to work more on open source. I wanted to share some of my learnings and some of my ideas through articles. And I just wanted to have some time to just learn new technologies and to have some more flexible time that I could spend in different ways. And when I started writing these weekly articles, my main motivation was honestly just to learn how to become a better writer. It was to see how many weeks I could continue writing and just like how much I could keep that up. And just like get to know more people, get to share my ideas, get to start conversations. Then as that kind of evolved and, in the beginning, no one was reading any of my articles. Like, it was like I was publishing and it wasn't like, a lot of people started reading them immediately. Like, this is something that evolved over time, over a long period of time. And when that started happening, like people started to discover my writing, they started to discover my project and started being a little bit more interested in what I was doing. My motivation has still remained the same. Like, my motivation still comes kind of from myself. I'm trying to do these different things as kind of challenges to myself, and I'm trying to constantly improve and become a better developer. But now I'm also really motivated just by, hearing that people are finding my things useful that I make. For example, when I work on some open source project and people are starting to use it, then I get more motivated to work on it. So it kind of becomes this positive circle where it started out from a place of me wanting to learn things for myself or to set a challenge for myself. And then it kind of ended up becoming this positive feedback loop of me getting feedback and getting inspired and motivated by that feedback.
Oh, wow, that's really inspiring. I didn't expect such a good answer.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I've been asked this question a few times before, so I've had some time to not prepared. Like, I don't have a written statement, but when you answer a question a few times, you kind of realize what you should say and things like that. But it's actually just as a quick aside, it's something that I try to always do is sometimes when you get asked the same question many different times, you can kind of naturally start to become I don't know, like a little bit tired of that question. You know what I mean? Like you're like, oh, not this question again. But I really, really try hard never to do that, because for the person who asked you that question, for example, if you're at a conference and someone comes up to you and asks you a question, for them, that's the first time they're asking this question, right? And I always try really hard not to, come off as I've been asked this question 100 times before, and now I just have to answer with this pre-written statement. I always try to answer it as if it was the first time.
And how do you describe your job to your parents or grandparents? What do you say?
I have an interesting situation where my dad actually used to be a programmer and a systems designer, and he's a very technical person. So when I talk to him about what I do, I usually get really into like the technical details. Like we talk about different algorithms and we talk about different technical solutions. He's retired now, but he's playing around a lot with his Raspberry Pis, and he's setting up all these like elaborate networks at home. So we talk a lot about these kind of things.
This is not fair. All of us have a very, very difficult time explaining our parents and grandparents what we're actually doing. So this is just not fair. Let me tell you.
It's not fair, right? But on the other hand, my mom, she works in healthcare. So with her, I don't have that luxury, if you will, to just be able to talk directly about the technical details. But that's something that's always been also very important to me, is to try to be as good as I can to explain technical things and my technical work to non-technical people. Because I really believe that that's an advantage to have as a developer, because you're not only working typically with developers who are just like you, who, for example, work on iOS or on Android. You are typically working with designers and product managers and all sorts of other people. And I think learning how to get as good as you can, I mean, it's not always easy, but learning to try to get good at explaining even the most technical things to non-technical people, I think is a really good skill to have. Because at the end of the day, like as developers, we are doing engineering work, right? We're trying to come up with solid solutions to problems. And I think if you can explain your solution to someone who is not in the same domain as you, then I really think you should ask yourself whether that is really a solid solution. Because I think, usually at least, the best solutions you can come up with, the most solid ones, are ones that you can actually explain in a reasonable amount of time, even to people who don't have the same knowledge as you.
You've just described my job description, actually.
Right. That's fantastic.
You've been very active online, especially on your website, Swift by Sundell. In fact, I've counted well over 450 pieces of content, roughly half of them being articles, tips. That's quite amazing in just 3 years. Would you not say so?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I usually don't like look so much at the count, right? This is one of those things where you just like keep going and you do one more, and then you look back and like you say, you count all of the things and you're like, whoa, I've done like several hundred articles. Like it doesn't feel like that when you are writing them. It just feels like you're doing one more. But, over time you end up with a large number, which is, it's really cool to look back. And like always, when you look back at your earlier work, sometimes you can feel a little bit like embarrassed, like, because of course you evolve over time and you become better at what you do. But it's always nice also to look back at the older things as well.
I think all developers face the same thing. You write something, 2 weeks later, you look back at it and thinking, what was I thinking about? What was I doing? Was I under this much pressure? Was I just half asleep?
Exactly.
It happens to everybody who is writing anything. Articles, code, whatever. It's all the same for all the writers, I guess.
It really is. And it's a good thing because it just means that you're evolving all the time, right? And like you're saying, it can only be over something like 2 weeks and you've still evolved and you've still learned new things. And you look back at that thing you wrote 2 weeks ago and you really think, that was not a great solution. And that's part of what I love about these different tasks and this industry, tech industry in general, is that, things are moving fast, which it can also be stressful sometimes. But it is really cool just how quickly you can really learn new things and evolve yourself, even though, again, it might not feel like it when you're in that thing and you are trying to, get this thing done or master this particular technology. But then you look back just over like the last couple of weeks or the last couple of months and you just realize just how much you've learned.
Wow, that's interesting. How does it feel to be a full-time indie developer? You went full-time since 2019? Are you happy with the results?
Yeah, I'm really happy. I still kind of, I pinch myself in the arm every now and then, and I'm like, is this real? Because I really consider it like a privilege, and I really consider it like an honor, if you will. Maybe that sounds too strong, but I really, really, I'm really happy and grateful that I'm able to do this full time, and I'm able to work on these different things. And of course, it's not always easy, right? It's not always fun, even like all jobs. It has ups and downs. Sometimes I feel like when we look at indie development or running your own business, being your own boss, it's sometimes easy to kind of over glorify it, and you think that, oh, you can always work on whatever you want, and it's such a lot of freedom, and you are always motivated because you're always working on your own thing. And it is, like I mentioned, it's really, really something I'm grateful for, and I am really enjoying it. But it also has challenges. It also has ups and downs. It also, it's something where you also have to motivate yourself constantly. You have to be your own boss. You have to self-organize. You have to keep the business running as well. So there's kind of a lot of aspects to it, which I guess I didn't appreciate as much before I went into it. And I thought, oh, I just have to write like one article every week and do one podcast every 2 weeks. That's great. All of the rest of the time will just be, whatever I want. And then it turns out that, well, that whatever you want is going to be filled with a lot of other things, which is a lot of fun things and a lot of challenging things and makes you grow. But it is definitely always a balance between doing things that kind of moves your business forward and doing things that you need to do, balancing that with also doing things that you want to do and pursuing new ideas.
Learning to motivate yourself was something that a lot of us had to learn in 2020.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's something that's been interesting for me during these last couple of months where for me, it was kind of doing the same thing in terms of the work because, I'm working from home. I've been working from home for 3 years now, over 3 years. And so the whole quarantine period of time was not that big of a difference for me in that sense. But of course, with everything going on in the world, with the, economic challenges going on around the world, it definitely impacted me pretty strongly. So it was definitely still a challenging period. And I hope we're kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel now and we are moving towards better times. But from that aspect, the self-motivation aspect, I didn't have so many problems with that part.
Lucky you.
Yeah. Well, I've learned it over years, right? In the beginning, it was challenging, but now I feel like I'm at least pretty good at self-organizing and trying to have a reasonable structure in my work life, not to have things to be too chaotic.
What made you go indie after leaving Spotify? Did Swift come out around that time or just got bored?
At Spotify, I kind of felt like, I'd been there for 3.5 years. I had accomplished what I kind of wanted to accomplish in terms of my growth as an engineer. I could, of course, go into management. I even tried that for a while. I was a lead developer for a while. I was running a few projects. But I kind of felt like I wanted to try something new. And, it's kind of funny where when people leave jobs, they will sometimes say, well, I'm going for new challenges or I'm going for new adventures, right? But typically that is code for I got paid more money from this other company. That is typically what people actually mean. But for me, it was really genuinely like I wanted to have a new adventure. I wanted to do something completely different. So I didn't want to go to another tech company. I didn't want to go to, do the same thing, but in another context. I wanted to do something very, very different. And I was a freelancer before I joined Spotify as well, so that was something that I was kind of familiar with. But I also wanted to try, working remotely. I moved to a new country, so I moved from Sweden to Poland. So it was really like a big adventure, and that's really something that motivates me a lot is to constantly like try to step out of my comfort zone and to do something that I don't feel entirely comfortable doing, but still something that I feel I can be good at. So I already signed up my first client before I left Spotify, so I knew that I had like some freelance work already planned and scheduled, so it wasn't too stressful that the first day I had to go out and find clients. But I felt like it was something that if I didn't try it, I would probably regret not trying it. I thought that I would do that and see how it was like working remotely, and yeah, so far I really, really love it.
So far, 3.5 years. That's a pretty nice so far.
Yeah, like things always change, right? And, there are days when I wake up and I'm like, oh, if I only had a quote unquote normal job, and I could just go into an office. I know people don't go into offices right now around most of the world, but where I could just go to a normal job, have coworkers and work like I used to, and everything would be so easy, right? Like, it's like the grass is always greener on the other side. And there are other days where I just am so happy that I'm working on my own. So It's always like trade-offs, and yeah, the grass is always greener, but overall I'm very, very happy with my current situation.
Nice. So, talking about getting out of your comfort zone, you recently started offering consultancy services for mobile teams. It just made me really curious about how you can help developers level up their skills, what exactly happens at a session like this. Just in general, what type of services do you offer?
This was kind of a natural continuation of kind of mixing my freelance work that I did previously as a full-time job with my new full-time job, which is, running my website and providing learning material and writing and podcasting and things like that. So the consultancy services that I currently offer are kind of like a mix of those two, where rather than doing freelance work in terms of let me work on for 6 months on this project or to build this app, I am typically going to companies when I could go to companies, but now I'm also doing some things remotely where I will do training. I will spend a couple of days with the team. I will mostly, honestly, help them kind of facilitate discussions, because one thing that's always been important to me is that I typically tell people I am not here to tell you what to do. Like I'm not one of those people who want to go to a team and this is my first day there and I'm going to act like I know everything and I should just tell them how they should change their code base, because they've been working on this code base for sometimes many, many years. So it would be ridiculous for me to claim that I know more about their code base than they do. But what I can do is that I can facilitate new discussions. I can inject some new ideas. I can ask a lot of questions. And that can then enable the team to come up with new solutions and maybe think in different paths that they didn't typically consider. Because something that can happen in a lot of teams, and I've been part of teams as well where this has happened, is that you kind of get a little bit stuck in circles. And it might not always feel like you're stuck, but you're kind of recycling the same ideas, you're facing the same problems, you have this certain tech debt that you know about, that you want to take care of, but you never have time. You kind of keep pushing it aside and, there's a new big release coming, so we'll just take care of it later. It can kind of feel sometimes that you're just running in circles. And I think what I can offer is to come in for just a few days and kind of try to break the team out of that circle, right? To have some new ideas, to have some dedicated time for learning, for discussing things, for coming up with plans to take care of tech debt, to maybe improve their testability, to maybe adopt DevOps practices, and these kind of things, right? So that's typically what I do. It's typically workshops, training sessions. I do code reviews as well. I do some mentorships. It's very flexible. It depends really on what the company needs.
That's really interesting, because in the previous episodes, we were discussing whether teams need a specialist or a DevOps engineer who tells them how they should practice DevOps, or they can just start doing it on their own. And I think this consultancy approach, where instead of telling them what to do, you facilitate discussions and creativity and just let them come up with their own ideas, is definitely a great new direction.
Right. I think in general, there are these different job descriptions where the job description is sometimes a little bit more geared towards telling other people what to do. And you have things like, a Scrum Master can act like this, or an architect, for example. And you can have like a testing infrastructure engineer who tells the teams how they should write their tests. I'm typically not so much of a fan of that way of working. And I'm not saying that all architects are like this or all Scrum Masters are like this. I think most people are not, but it can happen sometimes that you end up with this person in the organization whose role is just to like tell other people what to do. And I think a better approach, typically at least, is to not turn it into like design by committee where everyone has an opinion about everything, because that's really slow and inefficient, but rather to treat these people who are in these positions as kind of consultants, and where they go and embed with different teams. They work together with the teams to come up with solutions rather than always pushing solutions downwards. Because one thing that I think can really kill people's motivation and creativity is to always be told what to do. If you instead get ideas and you get challenges and you get questions, and then the teams themselves come up with the actual solution, then I think you end up with, first of all, a much, much wider, more diverse range of ideas and solutions from different people, but you also get the teams invested and motivated in their own work, which I think is super important.
Mm-hmm. When you hear the term mobile DevOps, which is quite a new term, what exactly does it mean to you, and how do you think it ties into this whole consultancy services project of yours?
So for me, mobile DevOps is all about enabling teams to execute faster. And I know that that's such a buzzword these days. Everyone is saying, oh, we're moving fast, we're moving fast. But sometimes, you can be so focused around the concept of just moving fast that you end up not moving fast at all. It's kind of ironic, where sometimes the term moving fast gets kind of interpreted as taking shortcuts, right? Where it's like, oh, we're moving fast, we're a startup, we're moving fast and we're iterating quickly, so we're not going to write tests, we're not going to do continuous delivery, we're not going to do continuous integration, we're just going to write the code as quickly as we can and ship it to our customers. And that's certainly one way of working, but I don't think that that's a way to create something sustainable or something that actually makes you move fast in the longer term. And when I say longer term, I don't mean like 10 years, I don't mean that kind of long term, I mean more like over time as you develop features to enable you to keep moving quickly. Because there's a lot of talk about tech debt, right, in our industry. People are always talking about, oh, I have this tech debt here or there, or we need to rewrite our app or rewrite our code base because we have so much tech debt. But this tech debt doesn't just magically appear, right? It just doesn't just get dumped on in your lawn on a morning, right? Like it actually builds up over time. And I think what DevOps is all about for me, and you can use different tools in the DevOps toolbox, but what it's all about, the goal is to enable a team to long-term execute fast and to keep their tech debt in check and to make sure that they strike a nice balance between delivering new features and moving quickly in that sense, in the product sense, while also being able to move quickly on the engineering side going forward.
What does the process look like when reviewing a project? What's your typical first step?
So it depends a little bit on what they've hired me to do. So it's usually what I do is that I will have a video call with the company, and I typically ask them to not just have like the person who is going to, pay the bill, which is typically like someone, a manager or maybe someone from HR sometimes, but to also invite a few engineers into that meeting. And I also love to work with engineers who are not just iOS developers, but also backend engineers, Android developers, and so on. Because I like to just get a feeling of what they really need and what they really want before I start like actually doing the work. But for example, if I'm going to do a code review, I actually really like to dive into a code base completely blindly. I don't want the company to give me like a PowerPoint presentation around how the code is structured or to, walk me through it for like 2 hours or something. I want them to just give it to me as if they would just give it to someone who just joins the team. So that means like give me access to the repo or send me a copy of the repo. Give me all the documentation that you would give a new joiner to your team so that I can kind of look at it with a fresh pair of eyes. Because I think, again, that's kind of the power of hiring someone from the outside to come in like this. It's that you get that different perspective. You get someone who is not in your culture, who is not in your loop of development, but you get someone who looks at it from the outside and looks at it with a fresh pair of eyes. So I like to be as unbiased as I possibly can when looking at a new code base. So that's typically how I like to do it.
How do you browse the code bases? Nowadays, Swift projects are becoming larger and larger, somewhat, 500,000, couple million lines of code. Some use storyboards, some don't.
I typically like to try to establish what the overall different user journeys look like if it's a very UI heavy application, which iOS apps tend to be. So if they have a storyboard, for example, I will open up the storyboard, I will look at what are the different segues and what are the different paths that the user can take through this app. But if they don't use storyboards, I typically just start at the app delegate and I look at what are the initial view controllers or views, how do the user go from there, what are the different models, how does things like the networking layer look like, how does that tie into the whole thing, what kind of data models do they have, what kind of data storage do they have. So it's almost like you just pick a starting point, and that can vary depending on the architecture, but typically it's like either like you look at the storyboard, you look at the app delegate, or you look at some kind of root view controller or something, and then you kind of just crawl the code base from there, almost like a web crawler, where you just command click your way through it. And then you try to establish like an overall kind of mental model of the code base, like a map, if you will. And then I typically take a lot of notes, I make mind maps and try to draw things out. And then I dive deeper into more specific areas and I take a look at, how does the actual networking work, for example? How does the actual database code work? But what's interesting is that I've now browsed a lot of code bases and I worked with a lot of teams. And almost all of them are very, very similar. Most teams are struggling with the same challenges. Most teams are architecting things in a similar way. Of course, there are sometimes different metaphors, like some people use a coordinator and other people call it a presenter, or other people call it a flow controller or something. There are different names and there are different metaphors, but the overall, I would say, structure and challenges that people face are very, very similar.
You've mentioned that you work with a lot of teams. So in your experience, have they been consciously trying to implement DevOps and DevOps practices? Or have you tried to give them a little push there?
I think if you go to different companies and you ask them to define what DevOps is, I think a lot of developers will struggle. And a lot of developers will say, well, I don't really know what that means. And honestly, I didn't either, like up until quite recently. Like when people said DevOps, I always associated that with like backend development and backend monitoring, for example, right? That was like DevOps for me because, for example, when I worked at Spotify, there were backend developers who were on call, and those were like part of like the DevOps team. And that for me, that's kind of what I associated it with. So I think when people hear that term, DevOps, they might have many different ideas on what that means. And sometimes they, even if they're, for example, iOS developers or client-side developers, like working on Android or on the web, they might just think that it has something to do with backend development, because that's really what I thought for a long, long period of time, until I actually realized that it's more a series of practices. And, you can have things like continuous integration or unit testing or continuous delivery. And those are all part of like your DevOps toolkit. I think a lot of teams are either doing some of those things. They don't necessarily call it DevOps. They just say, well, we have unit tests or we have UI tests, but they don't necessarily think of it as a DevOps workflow. I don't typically use this term either, to be honest. I tend to just more focus on the actual outcomes of it. You want to enable a continuous delivery of your product. You want to enable quick iterations where if people make a change, they can be confident that that change has high quality, and that change can then be delivered to your testers or to your end users as quickly as possible. So I think most teams are interested in things like that. They're not against it. But I think the overall like fundamental DevOps practices are maybe a little bit unknown for a lot of companies.
That's why we are here.
Yeah, I get it. That's really great. And I love this idea of mobile DevOps as a thing. The name of the show is great. It is really, really great, I think, that you are promoting these things, because it really is, like I mentioned, a toolbox where you can pick the tools from the toolbox that you think will be the best for your team and your situation. But being aware of what tools you have to use and being able to like pick the ones that you think are the most relevant, I think that is really, really valuable.
Actually, Damien, one of our colleagues, will be really happy to hear that you like the title because he came up with it.
Nice. Yeah, it's a really, really good one.
I hope he hears this.
Yeah, I love catchy titles like that. Like, when I named my podcast, I just named it Swift by Sundell because that was the name of my website, and I didn't really have any imagination like that. But I love names like this, which are very catchy.
iOS development comes in many forms. You've got Swift, Objective-C, React Native. Do you cover all languages that are common in iOS?
I'm very flexible. I still really like Objective-C. I was doing Objective-C for a really long time. I started iOS development around iOS 3, iOS 4, or something like that. So I did Objective-C for a really, really long time. And for example, when I was working at Spotify, when I was a freelancer before that, it was all in Objective-C. So Swift was something I started doing when it came out. I started doing it as like more on a hobby side of things, like on my own projects. And then I started doing it full time around like Swift 2, Swift 3. So I am definitely like not just about Swift. And I think that's something that is, I get that it's easy to kind of see me as that because, it's in the name of my website. It's what I write about. And it's kind of, for me, I had to pick a focus. I didn't want to just create a website about all things programming because it would be too unfocused. It would be hard to find, a continuous red thread throughout that. So I picked Swift as like my main focus point, but I still, on a weekly basis, I will typically write in at least like 3 or 4 different languages. So I will write Swift. I will often write still Objective-C and C, sometimes even C++. I write JavaScript occasionally, PHP, and all sorts of things. I've even done a ton of Java development as well, and C# and things like that. But When it comes to my consultancy services, I try to focus on what I think I know the best and where I'm the most up to date. So, for example, again, I love having conversations with the Android team, for example. And since I am not this person who likes to go in and tell people what to do, I can have these conversations with them, and we can bring in some people from the Android side, some people from the iOS side, and we can have more high-level discussions around data flows, around architecture, around how we communicate with the backend, data models, and things like that, without, saying, here's how you build this in Kotlin. Because, of course, I couldn't do that because I don't have that kind of experience with Kotlin right now. I've tried it, but I haven't done like full-time Kotlin development for many years, right? So I like to look a little bit beyond just the language itself and look more about what are we actually trying to build here, and we are working on different platforms that require us to work in different languages, and that's fine. And my focus right now is on Swift when it comes to my writing and the content that I make, but I just love programming in general in kind of all shapes and forms.
What would I expect from a code review?
So there are kind of two things that I typically do. So after I finish the code review, I will produce a report, and this report will typically be something around like 10 to 15 pages, like a PDF report. It's important for me that it contains not only like improvement suggestions or questions and things I found confusing, but also things that I think are great, like great patterns that I think the team should kind of double down on. Because again, like the outcome, the goal of this is not to have the team say, oh, great, now we're just going to take this report and rewrite our entire code base. That's really not the point. The point is to identify what are the good parts that you can use as a kind of blueprint to then improve the other parts. So you can end up with a more consistent code base. That's really the goal here. So, it's not so much about like, I like this pattern or this architectural style or whatever, and now we should change it to that. It's more like, what do you have currently and what can we start from and how can we make things more uniform? So the report will contain like improvement suggestions. It will contain both the kind of high level things like, here, this data flow is kind of hard to grasp, or it could potentially be error prone. This view controller is pretty big, so maybe you could split this up into this and this and that. This networking layer is used as a singleton, and you're currently accessing it from this table view cell, which maybe, can have problems in terms of cell reuse and things like that. So maybe you should try to split that out into something like a service that you can call and inject. So they're both kind of high-level architectural things like that, but also like more lower-level code-specific things as well, where, anytime I will look at the code base and I will kind of raise my eyebrow because I will be like, what does this really mean? I will take note of that, because if I feel like that, it's very high chance that a new joiner on the team who will join, in the future will feel the same way. And that's typically like the kind of company that hires me is companies that are not like super large, but they are growing a lot and they have reached a certain scale where they've realized that in order to keep growing and grow in a smooth way, we're going to have to establish some practices. We're going to have to establish some kind of specific styles and specific ways of doing things. And this is typically where they will bring in someone like me to kind of just make sure that they're going in the right direction.
Apart from the code part, are you giving advice on other processes too? On a bigger scale, or so not the practicalities of coding, but rather other processes for work?
Yeah, absolutely. I will typically do that as well. Typically, a lot of people are interested in my experience of working with different sizes of companies, from small startups to big companies like Spotify, and to just kind of hear different ways of organizing a team and the different trade-offs that are in there. So we can talk about things like, how big should a team be? Should it be cross-functional or not? How should you set up the goals for a team? Should you have something like OKRs, or should you have something like yearly goals, or should you just work on a project basis? So that's typically a lot of discussions that I will get into as well, is like, organizing a team and also just workflows in general. And that's something that I'm really, really passionate about, is that I love to try to find ways to make something more efficient, not only in a code sense, but also in kind of a workplace sense, where there are typically, again, teams that they might not realize it, but they're slowing themselves down by the way they are organized, or by the way they hand off work between different teams, or the way different teams collaborate. And just getting someone from the outside looking at that and spending a few days with them and seeing where those barriers might be and how they could be broken down or changed can be really, really valuable as well. And also really fun for me to kind of debug an organization also, not just the code.
In the past few years, one of the biggest changes was implementing continuous feedback loops and continuous peer reviews in cross-functional teams, as opposed to older, like waterfall-like methodologies, like handoffs and leaving things to be fixed in the next release. Can you talk a bit about the main advantages of this new approach?
I think there are a couple of advantages. One of the primary ones, I think, is that continuous feedback loop, like you mentioned, like getting feedback quicker. Because we all know that when we're working on different projects, there is a lot of context switching that we need to do. Not only like when we work on a code level and we're working on one class or one file and then we move over to another one and we have to just kind of reorient ourselves, but also on a project level. Like typically, even if you work on the same product, you will have many different projects and different features you work on. And typically when you change between them, you have to just spend a little bit of a time to just reorient yourself to figure out like what is the goal with this project, what are we trying to do, what is our current kind of iteration, what are the current designs that we're trying to go for and things like that. If we can get the feedback to the people who need the feedback as quick as we can, and it's not just developers, it's everybody who works on the product, then that will typically remove a lot of those barriers that I talked about earlier, like a lot of those roadblocks that you can end up with, and it will minimize those context switches. So as a very concrete example, let's say that I am working together with two other developers on a new feature. And we're working together with a designer. We're working also with some people who work on the web, who work on Android. We work with a product manager. And in turn, that product manager communicates with a few other stakeholders in the team who might need our new feature in order to progress because they need to connect with it somehow. All of a sudden, you end up like the code that I write as a single developer will impact maybe 20, 30 different people, and they rely on my work either directly or indirectly. If I can make sure that the work that I'm doing, I get feedback on it as quick as possible, and the other people also get feedback around how I've progressed on my task as quick as possible, then everybody wins, right? In this example, when I commit my code, if I can have that code be verified by automated tests, I can make sure that a build is automatically sent to all of these different people who are stakeholders in the project. If the designer can immediately see what has been implemented, if we can have our task management system also be continuously updated so that a tester can immediately see that this task now needs testing, or a designer can see that it needs verification. If I can even do something like I can sit down with a designer and show the work that I've done, or if we're working remotely to show it over video call and verify that we're heading in the right direction. All those different feedback loops just makes things so much smoother in the future, because what you want to avoid really is that you are working for like 3 weeks on something and then you quote unquote hand it off, right? In some way or another. And that's when you get the feedback. But the problem then is that the code you wrote 3 weeks ago, when we talked about it earlier, you maybe not even remember it, right? You're completely out of this context. Then you have to get back in the context, and that just slows things down so much. So that for me is really one of the absolutely major advantages is having a quick feedback loop and a quick iteration.
And also it can turn out that you've created something that wasn't well specified or doesn't work as somebody else intended. So that can come out earlier too.
Exactly. It really validates that you're heading in the right direction. And another thing that maybe is not as typically discussed when we talk about these types of things, we tend to focus on kind of the hard values, like, you can get your code into master quicker, or you can get a build out quicker. Like these are all kind of technical, mechanical things in your development process. But another thing that I think you shouldn't underestimate is kind of the quote unquote human side of things, where if you have more insight into other people's work, and I'm not saying like you should spy on people or, or always, make sure they're doing their work, but if you can get some insight into how they're working and what they're doing and how they're progressing, I think that also builds a lot of empathy, where instead of having these hard handoffs where a designer spends like a month designing a screen, then goes and sends a JPEG to the developer then takes that JPEG and starts building it, and then three weeks later sends it off back to the designer, and then the designer says, no, actually, I meant like this, or I meant like that. That is a typical recipe for having a lot of conflicts and having a lot of like blame game going on, where it's like, oh, it was the designer's fault. No, it was the developer's fault. Or this was badly specified. Or no, this was not implemented in the correct way. But if you have that continuous feedback loop and you're kind of living in each other's worlds a little bit, or you can see what the other person is doing, then I think that really builds a lot of empathy, and it really makes a team work better in terms of teamwork.
And work quicker, as we've already mentioned, that people, especially smaller companies, want to move swiftly. And then there you go. This is how you can develop in a quicker way, isn't it?
Absolutely, it really is. And it also lets you test more things quicker as well. One thing I always love to have as a setup is I want for example, my UI code to be as flexible as I can without over-engineering it, but to have it not make too many assumptions about the exact current layout configuration or UI configuration that I have today. Because one thing I really love to be able to do is to sit down with a designer, like I mentioned earlier, or again, have a video call if we're working remotely, and just iterate on things together to just say like, okay, how about we tweak this margin or this padding? Because one thing that I think you really want to avoid is something I like to call Jira ping pong. And Jira ping pong is when you have this Jira task, which is created by, for example, a product manager says, oh, this looks not great. It doesn't look like a spec. And then the designer will say, well, the developer should take care of this. And then the developer says, well, what's the margin? And pings it back. And it ping pong back and forth, back and forth. And you spend like days just figuring out who should fix this 5 pixels margin, where the actual code change is like literally changing a number. Like it's not advanced at all. And I think a lot of these things can, again, be removed by just working more closer together and having those quicker feedback loops where if you would have just worked together on that margin, you could just have fixed it in like minutes instead of spending days doing that Jira ping pong.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's so many tools nowadays that help with like handover between design and developer. You can even do simple things like just pair programming, but we shouldn't have to be in the point where we bounce back tickets back and forth just to get the job done, even if it's just a single value. And do you think how can continuous delivery enable more smooth cooperation within a team? Is there anything that would make it easier?
So I think what you really want to have is a setup where as soon as any change is made to the project, that it immediately gets into people's hands so that they can test it, so that they can try it out, and to it not be a big deal. Like if making a new build, like a beta build or just a development build is a big task, something that someone needs to do manually or something that is taking a lot of time or it just is annoying to do, then that's going to also slow you down. And it's again going to delay that feedback. So I love to have automatic things in place. For example, using Bitrise to have a pipeline in place where as soon as something gets merged into master or my development branch or whatever we're calling it, that goes out into people's hands, like so that people can download that build, so that designers can get their hands on it, product managers and other developers, so that we're always living on the latest version. Because that way, you're kind of also dogfooding your product. You're making sure that you're using it yourself. You're finding the rough edges, and you can also really get the feel for if this particular UI or this feature feels good in the hand. Because so many times when we are developing things, when we're designing things, we tend to do it on like a big screen, like it's really zoomed in. Like we're looking at this simulator screen, which is like 4 inches in your hand, but on the screen is like on a 27-inch iMac or something, right? So it's like super zoomed in. And then when you get it in your hand, you kind of realize, well, this animation doesn't really make any sense, or this button is too small, or this button is incorrectly placed. And again, it comes back to that dynamism in the UI. Like I really want to be able to then tweak that to not have that, again, be a big thing. Like to be something where if a designer comes up to me or sends me an email or a Slack message or whatever it might be and says, hey, I tried this build last night after you made this change and it doesn't really feel great. Can we instead move the button over here? And if I then have to spend a week doing that, then again, something is wrong. So I want to be able to just do that super quickly, get the build out again, get that feedback loop again, so that we can, really make the product the best that it can be.
Now that you've mentioned, what kind of tools do you use in your mobile development pipeline?
Bitrise, of course. I use it a lot for all of my different projects, both open source projects, libraries, apps, things like that. I think it's a really, really great tool. And part of what I really like about it is that you can construct pipelines, right? You can construct these workflows using the workflow editor, and you can do it visually in the browser, which I think, again, builds that common understanding. Because if you have to be a build engineer to set up a build pipeline, and you have to SSH into someone's Mac Mini under someone's desk or in a closet, and you have to, really advanced like scripting, or you have to write some bash script and then parse some YAML file or something in order to do these build pipelines, then that's not very accessible. And it becomes hard for people like who are iOS developers or Android developers to kind of self-service. And when I use something like Bitrise, I can just dive in and I can configure things myself, and I can do it in a very neat way. So that is a really great tool for me. I, of course, also use tools like Xcode, of course, for development, Swift Package Manager for dependency management. And then one thing that I really like to do is that I really like to write small tools and automation that's specific to my project. And that's something that I think once you get into the habit of doing it, it's so much easier than what you might initially think. So let's take something very concrete example. Let's say that you want to validate all the URLs that you have written in your code base somewhere. So you have URLs for talking to your backend API or to open some URL or something like that. And these URLs are just written as strings, and you want to make sure that they are actually real URLs. Like, that's something that you could write a quite simple little tool that kind of iterates over your different source files. It looks for example, HTTPS as a string, and then just make sure that that's a valid URL. And that's something that you could like spend an hour working on and developing. It again might not be like the most advanced version and like a general purpose tool that is the most beautiful thing ever built, but you can just write a little tool for yourself, put that in your build pipeline, and guess what? Now all of a sudden you never have to worry again about mistyping a URL, that you have an invalid URL in your app. So I think investing in these small little tools that you can build and using the Swift Package Manager, for example, it's really easy to just set up these tools and to execute them on your CI. I think that's something that's really worth investing in. And that's something I do for almost all my projects.
Your GitHub profile has quite a few web and scripting development projects. For example, the most recent one, Publish Inc. Do you feel you have enough support in terms of like automation, DevOps?
I have some basic things in place. Of course, it can always get better. I think the documentation side of things could definitely always get better. I think that's a common thing for most projects. I have spent quite a lot of time on documentation, and I always try to make sure that all of my open source projects are fully covered in terms of the actual code level documentation. Because I think, especially on the Apple side, a lot of developers have been frustrated during the last couple of years where you will in Xcode option click on a symbol and it will just say no overview available, right? That there's no documentation. So I at least make sure that there's some documentations for all the symbols. It might not be the perfect documentation, and when you then have to write more kind of high level, kind of conceptual documentation, that's something that typically takes a lot of time and something that I have written for most of my projects, but it can still get a lot better. But there is CI in place, so that every time someone opens a pull request, there is all different tests being run. I try to have, at least with these modern tools that I've built, to have close to 100% test coverage in terms of unit testing, to have some integration tests in place as well. Because the thing is that one thing I love about automated testing in general is that, like I mentioned earlier with this URL example, which is a kind of a small example in the grand scheme of things, but when you build these kind of automated tools, when you build tests, when you make sure that you have a wide coverage of your code base, it just gives you so much more confidence. When you are making a change or someone else makes a change and you're seeing someone submit a pull request and you don't know this person, you've never worked with this person before, you've never seen this code before, and now you have to merge it in and put it as part of your code base and deploy it in production, it's kind of a scary thing. But having a wide coverage of tests really gives you a lot more confidence, where you can just say, okay, well, if the tests pass, if there are no visible regressions, then let me merge this in if it looks okay. That is something I've really, really started to appreciate a lot when it comes to these libraries, is that I will not be able to test every single change super thoroughly myself manually in all different kinds of edge cases. But if I have tests that do that automatically, then I can feel so much more safe iterating on these code bases.
Nice. Once again, your website has over 40 pieces of content on testing, be it unit integration, UI tests. Would you say you're a big advocate of testing?
Yeah, I think so. I think one thing that I always like to point out is that I see testing as a tool. And I talked earlier about how I see also DevOps, mobile DevOps or DevOps in general, as kind of this toolbox where you have different tools in there, and testing is one of them. And of course, when we then open up that tool, it's almost like a mini toolbox inside of the toolbox where there's a lot of different types of testing you can do. I'm a fan of testing in general. I think it's a really, really useful tool to have in your toolbox. But I mentioned earlier that I aim for 100% test coverage in these particular projects, in these libraries that are more general purpose. But it doesn't mean that I am this kind of person who is always doing test-driven development, who always needs to have 100% test coverage. If you don't write tests, then you're doing things wrong. I'm not this kind of quote-unquote advocate. Instead, I try to look at it in a more pragmatic way. I try to use testing purely as a tool without getting too emotional about it, or without looking at testing as a way of life, but rather just as a development tool. So I think it's really great for catching certain types of regressions, for, again, ensuring that you can iterate on your code base and you have edge cases covered in a smooth manner. And especially when you're working on something like, I have a project, for example, called Splash, which is a syntax highlighter. That is, for me, a perfect candidate for test-driven development, where if I have a bug in there, I have a piece of code that doesn't highlight correctly, I just write a test case for it so I can reproduce it. I can then work on a fix, and then once the test pass, then I know that my fix was working. It's already been validated. I can push that into production, and I can just move on, because then I know that this particular bug will not happen again as long as that test is still there. So that's kind of how I look at testing in general.
Well, that's the perks of having a very high test coverage project. Would you say that is, your benchmark to get as close to 100% where possible?
When it comes to libraries, I like them to have as close to 100% coverage as possible. But I also like to have different kinds of tests in place as well. So I'm not only focusing on the unit testing side of things, but I also do things like integration testing. Because it's sometimes a danger if you only look at one metric, you only look at that test coverage in terms of unit testing. It can sometimes also give you kind of a false positive in terms of reassurance, where you can get into this kind of mindset of, well, I have 100% unit testing coverage, so as long as the test passed, then nothing will ever break. But you're going to miss a lot of things if you don't have integration tests, and if you don't do manual testing, and if you don't actually do continuous integration as well, so that you are always integrating your projects, the different dependencies and libraries with actual products. So one thing that I do in this sense is that I have my website, Swift by Sundell, is using all of these different tools that I've open sourced. So I haven't just open sourced them as an academic exercise, but I actually am using all these tools myself. And I think, you mentioned earlier just how many kind of pages are on my website. So I think for a long period of time, when we talk about publish and these kind of tools, I will probably be the biggest user of them, until someone builds an even bigger website using them. And that's a great thing, because it means that I am very likely to run into most of the issues, not all of them, but most of the issues myself. So I continuously integrate all of these projects. I'm always using the latest bleeding edge master of all of the projects in my own production code. And I think that kind of commitment is important, because that means that if I'm going to merge something in, I am putting it in production the same day. Because I typically deploy my website every single day, even on Fridays. That means that I need to make sure that these things are working really well. And that's why I also have invested in a high coverage, and I have integration tests in place to make sure that there's no regression happening at the integration point either.
Releasing on Friday, did I hear that correctly?
Typically, I release multiple times on a Friday. I really do literally continuous delivery, where as soon as I finished anything, I just deploy it, and it's all automated. For example, when I regenerate my website, I typically regenerate it locally, and I run it on localhost. I just make sure that, things still look good. I will look at things like the git diff to make sure that, the generation process actually didn't change anything it wasn't supposed to. And then when I'm done with my kind of just final sanity checking on my localhost, I just run publish deploy on the command line, and off it goes out into the live. I don't have a staging server. It just goes into production immediately.
There's not many people that do that. We at Bitrise see, especially on Fridays, that the amount of builds people do on a Friday, it's down by 20-30%. You compare that to Thursday, and it's a massive hike.
Right.
One of the few things I hear quite a bit, especially on my project, is when I'm doing testing, after writing a good couple hundred, unit tests, it tends to slow down the response time rather than taking a second, couple of seconds. It now takes close to 5 to 10 seconds, plus it takes another 10 seconds just to build. Do you have any recommendations or strategies to improve feedback cycle?
That's a very good question. And I think there are multiple things you can do here. Of course, the very best thing I think to do in this sense is if you feel like your tests are slow, that is a very, very good point for improving your overall software speed. So as an example, when I was working on Ink, the markdown parser that is powering my website and is used in Publish as well, I had this goal of I always wanted to execute whenever possible. It should be linear in terms of time complexity. Parsing Markdown, the Markdown text format, is something that is kind of tricky to do in linear time because sometimes you have to go back and forth and reparse things. But I really tried my very best to not do that whenever possible, to really execute as fast as I could. And the end result of that is that even though I believe, I may get the number wrong here right now, but I think there are around 150 tests for Ink, and they execute in like less than 1/10 of a second. The tests are super, super fast. And the tests are fast because the code is fast. And the code is fast because I really focused on it. I'm not saying I'm the best developer in the world and, I wrote the super fast code. I'm just saying that it was a goal of mine from the very beginning to try to write this code as quickly as I could. And I'm sure it can still be optimized and improved in certain ways, but having a goal of writing your software as fast as you can, again, it might not be perfect. It might not be, the absolute quickest solution that you could possibly come up with. But if you have performance as a goal from the very start, then that will trickle down. So if your software is fast, well, your user experience will typically be better. Your tests will be faster. You will have a quicker feedback loop. You can run things, build and run in Xcode way quicker. So there's all these benefits to writing fast software. So if you have a test suite which is executing slower, that is actually a great kind of benchmarking target. So you can benchmark that. You can say, okay, right now my test suite executes in 15 seconds. How can I bring that down? And you can start debugging that and profile it and look at it and see, okay, here's actually some slowness in my code. And you can identify parts of your code base that is actually slower than they need to be. And you can improve that, which just gives you better code overall. That you can do that to some extent. But when I bring up this example of Ink, for example, that is still, tests are like creating a markdown parser, sending in a string to it and asserting that the right outcome comes out. Those are kind of fast operations anyway. You're not like spinning up an app or navigating through its UI or creating a big view hierarchy and things like that. So I also recognize that not all projects have that luxury of just being able to execute that fast. So what you can do in those situations is if you find that your test suite is slowing you down, you can start gathering some data around what tests typically fail or what tests are typically always succeeding. And if you have a test that always succeeds, like, it's been succeeding every single build for the last 6 months or something, then what you can start doing is if you have some of those tests that are kind of heavy, again, use benchmarking, use profiling, make sure to check the data, not only intuitively, but actually check how long the execution time is. You can start moving those tests to run offline instead of online. So they might not need to run on every single pull request. They could, for example, run once every hour, or then maybe once every day, or before you make a release. There are many different approaches you can take. And you can kind of do the risk assessment there, because that's really what it's about here. It's all about risk assessment. And you can decide maybe some of these tests will run at a later time instead, and then I can make my iteration speed quicker. And I know that there are purists out there, again, these purists of test-driven development who say that is wrong. You should not do that. You're not doing continuous integration or delivery anymore. You are taking shortcuts. But I again think you need to be pragmatic and say, what's the risk versus reward, and what am I willing to pay for this particular benefit? So if you again have a test that has been always succeeding for a long time, it might still fail in the future, but you should still run it, but maybe you don't need to run it on every single pull request. So I think making those decisions and splitting up your test suite into multiple ones that you can run on in different conditions can also be a really great way to just speed up the overall iteration time.
I'll definitely try that. Yeah, let's move on to mobile DevOps.
We've mentioned several things here, like test automation, continuous feedback loops, continuous delivery, and all of these things. These can really help accelerate the process and help developers save time. And I was wondering if, besides these things that you've already mentioned, would you have some tips for developers, especially in cross-functional teams, to make sure that they can focus on creating new functionalities and just provide a great user experience in general?
There's a couple of things here. I think I mentioned earlier that a really good way to kind of create a better environment and better teamwork in a team is to kind of set your workflow up in a way that kind of builds empathy between different disciplines and different parts of the work. And I think this is also really crucial here as well. If you have a cross-functional team, if you have a team that works on many different platforms and you have people working together with design, development, product, and so on and so forth, trying to involve, again, don't turn it into design by committee, but trying to involve multiple people from different disciplines in the different changes that are going on. So to take an example from when I was working at Spotify, one thing that we did at Spotify was we established this architecture called backend-driven UI. What that was all about was to enable us to iterate faster. Instead of just sending the data from the backend as part of a JSON response, like here are my models, we actually started sending view models. We started sending layout information and a way for the view to be built up based on that particular backend response. And in the beginning, that was kind of just a technical solution to some problems we had, and we wanted to be able to iterate on our UI quicker, to be able to have different configurations and things like that. But what ended up happening from kind of also like a cultural point of view was that all of a sudden, instead of having an Android app, an iOS app, a web app, and then a backend system, it kind of became just different parts of an overall larger system. So sometimes when I was doing UI development, I actually had to make a change in the backend code. Rather than just waiting for a backend developer to do that, to say like, okay, let me sit here and wait now for a week until that backend developer has time to do it, it just became natural for client-side developers to start diving into the backend code base, make changes there, and submit a pull request. And the same thing happened vice versa as well. Like backend developers started becoming interested in client-side development. And they were like, okay, we're going to add this property. How can we add that on the client side as well? How can we make sure that it works well on both iOS and Android and on the web? And it really created this really nice atmosphere in the teams where we were all working on the same system, even more so than what we did before. The learning that I have from this, I'm not saying that every team should work with this particular architecture, but the learning for me from that is that the more overlap we can have between the different platforms that we work on, and the more people can be naturally interested, not just because a manager told them, but naturally interested in the different disciplines and on the different platforms, the better. So if we can have Android developers look at the changes made on the iOS side and read that code and be part of those code reviews, and vice versa, that just enables a whole new level of knowledge sharing and ideas and code sharing that, is something that I think a lot of teams are missing out on if you're just creating these silos, if that makes sense.
Of course, silos is, wow. We often talk about working in silos and how that should be avoided as much as possible. So that just resonates very much with some of our discussions.
Yeah, it's a typical problem. I mentioned earlier that a lot of teams are facing similar challenges, and this is definitely one of them, because I get it. Like, if you're an iOS developer, you have enough things to worry about on iOS than to learn Android or learn web development or learn backend development. Like, we sometimes have this, I think, idea that all the developers will just be able to learn everything, but it's so difficult. Like, with all the rapid changes that are happening, if we, again, just look on the iOS side of things, just during the last year, like Apple has completely changed the new UI framework, like with Swift UI that is now coming up, and there's all new sorts of tools that are coming out all the time, and keeping up with those, and then also like being interested in learning Android or web, it's super hard. I really get it. So it's not like I'm not expecting all developers to know everything and become experts in everything, but if we can just dip our toes in the different water that different people are swimming in, great metaphor here, then I think that just really builds a lot of empathy, and it really just, again, opens up ways of communicating and sharing ideas that are previously difficult.
Apart from learning and sharing ideas and learning from others, do you have any other advice to people who are new to mobile development and DevOps?
Yeah, my main advice would probably be to, again, don't look at it as a way of life, or don't look at it as it's either all or nothing. Like, you either need to completely buy into the idea of DevOps and you have to completely have a perfect continuous integration and delivery setup and it's all or nothing. You can start simple. You can write your first unit test. You can set up a continuous delivery pipeline using something like Bitrise, combine it with something like Test Flight that Apple provides to send out builds, or whatever tools that you might use to just like get started with something. And I think that's really something that is always important to keep in mind, is that when you look at some of these things, it can just seems like these huge effort that is going to take months and months. You have to stop what you're doing and just spend months on it. But that's not typically the case. You can take a day or two here or there and spend it on just trying to improve your overall workflow.
Baby steps.
Baby steps, yeah. Because that's the thing. Like, what's the difference between a team that executes really, really efficiently and a team that doesn't? It's not that the team that executes efficiently were super smart and they came up with a perfect architecture to begin with, and they just designed it completely perfect way, and they thought of all the edge cases, and they thought about all the different product changes up front. They didn't. Like, no one does. Like, no one can see into the future. I think the main difference between a team that executes efficiently and a team that does not is that the teams that execute fast, not only like this moving fast thing, but actually really moves fast in the long term, it's because they're continuously always trying to improve. They're taking baby steps. They're introspecting and looking at what are we doing right now and how can we improve it, and spending a little time here and there to continuously improve. I think that makes a huge difference. Again, might just be like a few hours here and there, or a day here and there that you spend on setting these things up, but it can just pay off so much in the long term.
Yeah, you can save a lot of time by setting up all these things. I totally agree. And that you've mentioned future. No one can see the future, but what do you think of the future trends of DevOps? Can you see some patterns that you might want to share?
Yeah, I think if you extrapolate this idea, so the whole kind of purpose of DevOps and the idea is to enable quicker feedback loops. So how can we kind of extrapolate that and take that to the next level? I think it will be to enable different kinds of changes to be made in a more lightweight way. So as an example, there's a lot of teams that have something like their layout configurations and their fonts and their colors defined in JSON files. And then what they can do is that they can either have a designer actually go in and make those changes and say, well, actually, I want to tweak a color, similar to my story before about how I didn't want to wait for a backend developer to make that small little backend change. A designer might have the same kind of eye-opening experience of saying, well, this is just a value in a file. I can just go in and change that. Then the thing is done. I don't have to do that Jira ping pong again. So I think if you take that further and you say, okay, so now we have something where we have a JSON file, but it's still like, you have to clone the project, you have to open it up in Android Studio or in Xcode, you have to make that change. How can we make these things even quicker? And how can we enable people to tweak things, to iterate on things without always having to go back and edit the source code? And I think for mobile developers, we can take a lot of inspiration from game development. When you do game development, especially like big AAA game development, like really large games, they typically have a game engine, which is like the core logic, the rendering code, like the actual like business logic, as we like to call it, like the actual core of the game itself. But then they have multiple layers of scripting, of different like assets that go into the game, different graphics and sound and files. And these are typically things that anyone who works on these things can edit themselves. So I have a lot of friends who work in the game development industry, and some of them are graphics artists. They can iterate on the graphics and check them into the project, and they appear in the game immediately. And I think we can learn a lot from that as mobile developers, of saying that maybe there are some things we can do to split up our code base to say, here is our app engine, here's our actual core logic that developers are focused on, that write them in Swift or Objective-C or Kotlin or Java. And that's going to be our core logic, and that's what the developers focus on. But then we might have things like scripts that sit on top of that, or different assets, or different configuration files, or maybe a CMS where you can make changes and it appears in the app, and that can all feed into the code base. I think that is kind of the natural progression of DevOps, where you can make changes quicker in different ways, which is not always I have to go back and make the change in the actual code base.
Oh, that was really interesting, the thing you said about the natural progression of DevOps. I think it's a really good way of phrasing it. Anyway, so now that we've talked about the different aspects of your daily work, and how busy you are, releasing even on Fridays. It made me curious about what you do in your free time. Do you read books about DevOps, or is there something you'd recommend that would be useful so we can learn more about it?
I don't really have any concrete, book about DevOps or something that I can recommend here, unfortunately. I recommend following blogs like, you at Bitrise, you have a great blog, which I'm occasionally writing articles there as well, which you can follow. Try to find people in the industry, in the community who are passionate about this, who are writing about these things that you want to learn. One thing I will recommend here, which is kind of like maybe a strange recommendation, but I will go for it anyway. And it's kind of like a little bit of a meta recommendation. I will recommend that if you're listening to this podcast and if you get most of your sources of information from Twitter or other social networks, if you see articles on Twitter and that's the way you get them, that's the way you get to know about them, I would encourage people to download an RSS reader, to install an RSS reader and to subscribe to different feeds and to get content this way. And I know it sounds like the 90s, going back to before we had social media to use RSS, but there's a lot of great RSS clients and most blogs and websites out there support RSS. And it's a great way to get a diverse set of materials and things to read in a way that is not just kind of curated by some algorithm on a social network. I would recommend downloading an app. If you use a Mac, you can download a NetNewsWire. It's a awesome RSS reader that is free. It's also open source, so you can also learn from that code base if you want to learn about Mac and iOS development. It's also available on iOS as well. To then go to your favorite websites and subscribe to their RSS feeds, to try to find new websites and subscribe to them. And to that end, if you don't really know where to find feeds, and especially if you're an iOS developer, my friend Dave Verver, who also runs the iOS Dev Weekly newsletter, he has a great website called the iOS Dev Directory, where you can see hundreds of different sites that publish articles on a regular basis, and you can subscribe to their RSS feeds. And that way you can kind of build up your own little personal newspaper that you can open up every morning as you drink your cup of coffee, and you can read really cool articles from many different sources. And this is something that I would recommend anybody who wants to double down on their learning to try to and don't just subscribe to the big names or the people you already heard about. Try to find things on this website or on other websites like it, feeds that from people you didn't hear about, from different backgrounds, from different aspects of programming, and subscribe to their feeds and read what they have to publish. I think that would be my biggest recommendation.
One thing to note, a lot of developers are on Twitter. We see a lot of snippets, blog posts, there's always talked on Swift, iOS, just general development. Most of our community are on Twitter. It's always a good source.
It is a really good source, but I think the danger also is that since Twitter and other social networks are increasingly becoming driven by algorithms, you are not seeing your timeline anymore in just just all the tweets from all the people you follow. You're seeing this more kind of algorithmically curated timeline. And I don't want to get into a debate whether that's right or wrong, but it does present a challenge when it comes to trying to find a good, diverse source of information. And I think that is something where, not just stopping using Twitter, that's not what I'm advocating here, but also subscribing to different feeds and reading articles that way. I just think it just gives you a more well-rounded sources of information than just relying on Twitter.
It helps you get out of the bubble that you're actually in.
It really does, yeah. And it lets you also challenge yourself to say okay, here's a website or a blog that from a person I don't know. And you can challenge yourself to, okay, let me get into this person's way of thinking or read what they have to write. And you can just do that in a super lightweight manner. It's literally just like copy and pasting a URL into an RSS feed, and there you go. So I would really, really recommend for those of you who haven't tried using an RSS reader to really try to get into it, because it's something I use more and more. I would say I read more in my RSS reader these days than I do on Twitter. And I think it's usually a better source of information.
I think I haven't used an RSS reader since they killed Google Reader.
Right. A lot of people think that because Google Reader was dead, that RSS is dead, but RSS is still live and kicking.
That's an unusual idea. I definitely gonna try it. Well, retry it.
Yeah, and again, if you're using a Mac, you can, like NetNewsWire, I just can't recommend this app enough. It's just like a fantastic app built by Brent Simmons and a team of developers he works with. It's open source. It's just fantastic. It's a great Mac app. And yeah, it just makes it really, really enjoyable to read different feeds, which is just super cool.
Thank you for the recommendation.
Well, cheers.
Well, that's all the time we had for today. Thanks so much for coming, John. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it's been such a pleasure for me as well. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I would love to be on the show again sometime in the future.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add that I've learned so much from you today, and I'm sure that the listeners will feel the same.
That's great.
So thanks again for coming to the podcast, and we'll definitely see you again.
You can follow John on Twitter at John Sundell, or check out his podcast, blog posts, and consultancy services on his website, swiftbysundell.com. Thanks everyone for listening to Mobile DevOps is a Thing, and stay tuned for the next episode. See you.
See you. Bye.
See you. Bye.